Deep in the Colorado mountains, where aspen trees whisper ancient secrets and morning mist clings to forgotten valleys, Thomas McKenna stood on 20 acres of raw wilderness with nothing but a rusty pickup truck and $17 to his name. His wife of 15 years had just taken everything, the farm, the house, even his beloved workshop, leaving him with court papers that called him worthless and incapable of providing. But Margaret had made one critical mistake. She never knew about Thomas's past as a master craftsman who once built million-dollar cabins for Hollywood elite before he chose love over money and became the simple farmer she eventually grew to despise. Now, with calloused hands that remembered every technique, every joint, every secret of working with wood, Thomas began felling trees with methodical precision. What he built in those mountains wasn't just shelter. It was a testament to human resilience, a work of art so breathtaking that when photos eventually surfaced online, they would go viral within hours. But why had Thomas hidden his extraordinary talents for so long, and what drove him to create something so magnificent from his deepest heartbreak? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The first tree came down with a satisfying crack that echoed through the valley like a gunshot. Thomas wiped sweat from his brow, the October air crisp against his weathered skin. The borrowed chainsaw from his neighbor Jake was older than his marriage had been, but it would do. Everything would have to do now. He'd driven these winding mountain roads for 3 days before finding this plot of land. 20 acres of forgotten wilderness that the county was practically giving away for back taxes. The seller, a tired-looking clerk named Brenda, had asked no questions when Thomas paid cash from the small emergency fund Margaret never knew existed. She'd simply handed over the deed and wished him luck with what she assumed was a camping trip. If she only knew. Thomas ran his hand along the bark of a towering pine, his fingers reading the tree like others might read a book. This one would give him the structural beams he needed, straight grain, minimal knots, perfect for bearing weight. The aspen grove to the east would provide interior paneling, their pale wood almost luminescent when properly finished. And the ancient oak standing sentinel near the creek, that would become something special, something Margaret could never have imagined him capable of creating. The irony wasn't lost on him. For 15 years he'd played the role of simple farmer, content to grow corn and raise cattle while his wife slowly grew bitter about their modest life. She'd married him believing he was ambitious, that the farm was just a stepping stone to bigger things. When it became clear he was content with their quiet existence, her love had curdled into resentment. "You have no vision," she'd screamed during their last fight, throwing his morning coffee mug against the kitchen wall. "No drive. You're just ordinary." Ordinary. The word had stung more than he'd expected. If she'd known about the Malibu estate he'd built for that action star, or the mountain retreat in Aspen that had graced the cover of Architectural Digest, would she have stayed, or would she have resented him for different reasons, for giving up that world, for choosing her over fame and fortune? Thomas selected his second tree, a straight pine about 60 feet tall. The chainsaw roared to life again, and he lost himself in the familiar rhythm of cutting. Each tree that fell was measured and marked in his mind, part of a design that was already taking shape with crystalline clarity. He could see it all, the sweeping rooflines, the cathedral ceiling, the way natural light would filter through strategically placed windows to illuminate hand-carved details. By sunset, he'd felled 8 trees and begun the process of limbing them. His back ached, his shoulders burned, but his spirit felt lighter than it had in months. This was what he was meant to do. This was who he'd always been, underneath the facade of the humble farmer. As darkness settled over the mountains, Thomas built a small fire and opened a can of beans for dinner. The flames danced against the raw logs that would soon become his home, and he allowed himself a small smile. Margaret thought she'd left him with nothing, but she'd actually given him the greatest gift of all, his freedom. The first phase would be survival, a basic shelter to get him through winter, something sturdy but simple. Then, when spring arrived and the snow melted, He would begin his real work. He would craft something that would take people's breath away, something that would remind the world that art could emerge from the deepest pain. His phone buzzed with a text message. Jake checking on him, probably worried about the crazy man who'd bought wilderness land with winter approaching. Thomas smiled and typed back a simple response. Day 1 complete. This is going to be something special. He had no idea how prophetic those words would prove to be. The papers felt heavier than they should have in Marcus Chen's calloused hands. 23 years of marriage dissolved into legal jargon and property divisions, each paragraph another knife twist in wounds that hadn't even begun to heal. He sat in his rusted pickup truck outside the courthouse, watching his former life disappear in the rearview mirror as Patricia walked away with her lawyer, designer heels clicking against concrete with the finality of a closing door. The farm was hers now. The house where he'd carried her across the threshold, where they'd planned to raise children who never came, where he'd nursed her through her mother's death and she'd held him after his father's funeral. All of it belonged to someone who now looked at him like a stranger. The settlement had been swift and merciless. Patricia got the property, the equipment, even the dog. Marcus got his clothes, his grandfather's toolbox, and 30 days to vacate. He'd tried to explain about the nightmares that still woke him screaming, about the things he couldn't forget no matter how many crops he planted or how many fence posts he repaired. But Patricia had grown tired of loving a ghost, tired of competing with memories she couldn't understand. "You're not the man I married," she'd said during one of their final arguments. If only she knew how right she was. The drive to the mountains took 3 hours, winding through forests that grew denser with each mile. Marcus had discovered this place years ago, during one of his long walks, when the walls of the farmhouse felt too close, when the silence between him and Patricia became unbearable. The old logging road was barely visible now, overgrown with brambles and saplings that scraped against his truck's sides like grasping fingers. He parked at the road's end and walked the final half-mile on foot, his grandfather's toolbox in one hand and a duffel bag of clothes in the other. The clearing opened before him like a green cathedral, 60 acres of pristine wilderness surrounded by towering pines and crossed by a crystal stream that sang over smooth stones. No power lines, no cell towers, no neighbors to ask uncomfortable questions about his past. The first night, he slept under the stars with nothing but a tarp for shelter. The mountain air carried scents that triggered unexpected memories, sawdust and steel, the acrid smell of cutting torches, voices shouting coordinates in languages most people couldn't identify. He pushed the memories down, focusing instead on the immediate needs: water, shelter, warmth. But as dawn broke over the mountains, something shifted inside him. His hands, roughened by years of farm work, began to move with a precision and purpose that surprised even him. He walked the perimeter of the clearing, his eyes seeing not what was, but what could be. Elevation changes, drainage patterns, sight lines, calculations formed in his mind with mathematical certainty. From his grandfather's toolbox, he withdrew tools that hadn't seen daylight in over 2 decades. A surveyor's transit, still gleaming despite its age, a set of architect's squares, drafting instruments wrapped in oiled leather. Patricia had always assumed they were antiques, family heirlooms with no practical value. She'd been wrong about a lot of things. Marcus spent the morning sketching in a composition notebook, his hand moving across the pages with fluid confidence. The design that emerged bore no resemblance to the simple farmhouse he'd called home for so many years. This was something else entirely, a structure that seemed to grow organically from the landscape itself, its lines flowing like water, its proportions speaking to some deeper understanding of space and form. By afternoon, he was marking trees, not randomly, but with surgical precision. Each mark represented hours of calculation, consideration of grain patterns, structural load requirements, and aesthetic balance. His movements held the efficiency of someone who'd done this before, though when or where remained buried beneath layers of carefully constructed normalcy. The first tree fell at sunset, a massive pine that crashed through the forest canopy with a sound like thunder. As Marcus stood over the fallen giant, something loosened in his chest, a knot of grief and anger that had been choking him for months. The divorce papers crumpled in his jacket pocket were yesterday's pain. This, the sharp bite of sawdust in his nostrils and the weight of an axe handle in his grip. This felt like coming home. He worked by moonlight, stripping branches with movements that were almost ritualistic. Each cut revealed the golden heart of the wood beneath, and with each stroke, more of his carefully buried past began to surface. Names, faces, blueprints for buildings that officially didn't exist, projects that required security clearances and skills that simple farmers weren't supposed to possess. As the moon tracked across the star-filled sky, Marcus Chen began to disappear, leaving behind only the echo of who he'd really been before love and loss had convinced him to bury his true self beneath rows of corn and the illusion of ordinary life. The morning dew still clung to the grass when Sarah Martinez pulled her pickup truck onto the shoulder of Old Pine Road. As the county building inspector, she'd seen her share of unpermitted structures, ramshackle sheds, illegal additions, the occasional treehouse that violated setback requirements. But the call she'd received yesterday had been different. Mrs. Henderson from the adjacent property claimed someone was building a mansion in the protected watershed, using heavy machinery at all hours. Sarah grabbed her clipboard and camera, expecting to find the usual suburban encroachment. Instead, she found herself staring at a barely visible trail that disappeared into dense forest. No tire tracks, no equipment marks in the soil, just a path worn smooth by footsteps. The 20-minute hike left her questioning Mrs. Henderson's credibility until the trees parted and she stopped dead in her tracks. Before her stood the skeleton of something extraordinary. Massive timber beams rose from a foundation of fitted stone, each joint cut with mathematical precision. The frame wasn't just functional, it was art. Curved braces flowed like frozen water, supporting a roofline that seemed to defy gravity while respecting every natural contour of the land. "You're trespassing." Sarah spun toward the voice. A man emerged from behind the structure, and she had to consciously close her mouth. Tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair streaked silver at the temples, he moved with a quiet confidence, someone completely at home in the wilderness. His hands, she noticed, bore the calluses of hard work, yet his bearing suggested education, refinement even. "I'm Sarah Martinez, County Building Inspector." She held up her badge, fighting to maintain professional composure. "We received a complaint about unpermitted construction." His laugh was warm, unexpected. "Let me guess. Mrs. Henderson heard heavy machinery, among other things." Sarah gestured at the frame. "This requires permits, engineering approval, environmental impact studies." "Does it?" He stepped closer, and she caught the scent of wood shavings and something else. Expensive cologne, perhaps, though that seemed impossible given his current circumstances. "I'm not selling it, not connecting to utilities, just a man building shelter on his own land. This is protected watershed. Check your maps again." He pulled a folded document from his pocket. "I own 47 acres here. Bought it 18 months ago." Sarah examined the deed, genuine surprise flickering across her face. The purchase price made her breath catch. "You paid 4 times assessed value. Privacy costs money." She looked up at him, studying the intelligent green eyes, the weathered face that spoke of recent hardship. "What's your name?" A pause. "James." "James?" "Just James, for now." Sarah walked closer to the foundation, running her hand along stones fitted so perfectly no mortar was needed. "How are you moving these? Some of these blocks weigh 600 pounds. Leverage, physics, time." "That's not an answer." James smiled, transforming his face entirely. "You want the technical answer? Block and tackle systems, fulcrums, and very careful planning. I studied the old methods, how they built cathedrals, moved monoliths. It's not magic, Ms. Martinez, just lost knowledge." "You studied? Where?" Another pause. "Various places." Sarah's inspector training kicked in. Something didn't add up. The precision of the cuts, The complexity of the joinery, the sophisticated understanding of load-bearing requirements. This wasn't hobby-level craftsmanship. You're a professional. Architect? Engineer? Was. Once. James turned toward the frame, effectively ending that line of questioning. Would you like the tour, since you're here officially? Despite herself, Sarah nodded. As they walked, James explained the design with casual expertise that made her head spin. Passive solar heating, thermal mass principles, cantilevers that distributed weight while creating dramatic overhangs. Every detail served multiple purposes, form and function united in ways that made conventional construction seem primitive. The roof system alone, she murmured, craning her neck upward. This should require steel supports. Should it? James pointed to a massive beam that curved impossibly through space. White oak, properly seasoned and joined, stronger than steel when you understand the grain structure. The Japanese have built like this for centuries. You studied Japanese joinery? Among other things. Sarah lowered her camera, realizing she'd been unconsciously documenting everything. I should cite you. Shut this down pending proper permits. You could. James met her eyes directly. But you won't find any violations. I know the codes, Miss Martinez, better than most. A long moment passed between them. Sarah felt something shifting, as if the professional boundary she'd maintained for 15 years was suddenly permeable. The complaint mentioned noise. Mrs. Henderson said heavy machinery, late-night construction. I work by hand. The only sounds are hammer and saw. James gestured toward the forest. Perhaps she's hearing other things. Deer can sound surprisingly industrial when they're moving through deadfall. Sarah knew she should leave, file her report, recommend a full environmental review. Instead, she found herself asking, how long have you been living out here? 3 months. Where? James pointed to a tarp-covered area near a small stream, rough shelter barely adequate. Looking back at the magnificent frame taking shape, Sarah began to understand. This wasn't just construction. This was transformation. The morning mist clung to the valley floor like gossamer threads when Marcus first heard the helicopter. He'd been awake since dawn, sketching plans for the foundation on a piece of bark with charcoal from his fire, but the distant thrumming made him look up sharply. The sound grew louder, circling his clearing twice before moving on toward town. He dismissed it as routine, emergency services, maybe a medical transport. But when Sarah Chen emerged from the tree line an hour later, her breath coming in short puffs and her camera bag slung across her shoulder, he knew his solitude was about to end. Jesus, Marcus, she called out, stopping at the edge of his camp. What the hell are you doing out here? Sarah had been covering local news for the Millbrook Gazette since before his marriage fell apart. She'd always been fair in her reporting, never sensationalizing his divorce proceedings the way some others had. But her presence here meant someone had been talking. Building a house, he said simply, not looking up from his sketching. She moved closer, her journalist's eye cataloguing everything, the precision of his camp layout, the expertly notched logs he'd already prepared, the way every tool had its designated place. This isn't just throwing up a cabin, is it? I've seen your sketches. Marcus glanced at her sharply. What sketches? The ones you left at Brennan's hardware store. Tom's been showing them to anyone who'll look. Says they're unlike anything he's seen in 30 years of construction. She pulled out a small recorder. Mind if I ask you a few questions? Yes, I mind. Sarah lowered the recorder but didn't put it away. People are curious, Marcus. You disappear into the woods with nothing, and suddenly there are rumors about some kind of architectural masterpiece being planned up here. The helicopter this morning? That was my editor, trying to get aerial shots. The news hit Marcus like cold water. He'd chosen this spot specifically for its isolation, surrounded by steep ridges that would make casual visitors think twice. But if news crews were already circling, his privacy wouldn't last long. There's no story here, he said, rolling up his bark sketches. Come on, Sarah's voice softened. I've known you for 5 years. You built barns and repaired fences. Good work, but nothing that would make an architect weep. She gestured toward his log preparations. "These joints you're cutting." I showed the photos to my brother in Seattle. He's a structural engineer, and he says some of these techniques haven't been used since the medieval guild system. Marcus felt the familiar tightness in his chest, the same sensation he'd experienced during his marriage whenever Elena got too close to asking the right questions. "Your brother doesn't know what he's talking about. The foundation stakes you've laid out, they're using golden ratio proportions. The timber you've selected shows an understanding of wood grain that would impress a master craftsman." Sarah stepped closer, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. "Who are you really, Marcus Thorne?" The question hung in the air between them like smoke from his morning fire. Marcus found himself studying Sarah's face, the genuine curiosity mixed with something else. Not the predatory hunger of a reporter chasing a story, but the look of someone who'd recognized that the quiet farmer they'd known was just the surface of something much deeper. "I'm someone who wants to be left alone." "The divorce records are public," Sarah continued, ignoring his deflection. Elena cited irreconcilable differences, but there were sealed depositions. The bank foreclosure happened suspiciously fast for someone who'd never missed a payment. "And your marriage license, it shows you moved here from Portland, but there's no employment history there, no credit history, nothing before 8 years ago." Marcus began breaking camp with deliberate efficiency, each movement economical and practiced. "Sounds like you've done your homework." Enough to know that Marcus Thorne either materialized out of thin air 8 years ago, or he's very good at erasing his tracks. She paused. "The question is why?" As he worked, Marcus felt the careful construction of his new life beginning to crack. He'd come to the wilderness to escape the complexity of human relationships, the exhausting effort of maintaining a false identity. But even here, his past was seeping through like water finding fissures in stone. "I'll make you a deal," Sarah said finally. "I won't publish anything without your permission, but I want to document what you're building here. Something tells me it's going to be extraordinary." Marcus shouldered his pack and looked out over the valley where morning light was burning away the last of the mist. In the distance, he could see the town where he'd spent 8 years pretending to be someone simpler than he was. Below him lay the foundation stakes of what would either be his masterpiece or his undoing. "One condition," he said at last. "When people ask why, you tell them you don't know." Sarah nodded slowly. "But you do know, don't you? You know exactly why." Marcus didn't answer. Some truths were too dangerous to speak aloud, even in the wilderness. The sound of sawing echoed through the morning mist as Marcus worked a crosscut blade through a massive oak trunk. 3 weeks had passed since he'd first arrived at this forgotten piece of wilderness, and already the forest bore the marks of his vision. What had once been an impenetrable tangle of undergrowth now revealed careful pathways, and the clearing he'd chosen sat like a natural amphitheater among the towering trees. His hands moved with practiced precision, each stroke of the saw deliberate and measured. The rhythm was meditative, drowning out the persistent voice in his head that whispered Sarah's name with every exhale. The divorce papers were final now. He'd received the certified letter 2 days ago, delivered to the general store in town where he'd arranged for mail pickup. 23 years of marriage reduced to legal jargon and a judge's signature. Marcus paused to wipe sweat from his brow, studying the massive beam he'd just cut. The oak was perfect, old growth with a grain so tight it would outlast centuries. Most people would use a chainsaw for this work, but Marcus preferred the slow ceremony of hand tools. They connected him to the wood in ways that screamed engines never could. A twig snapped behind him, and he turned to find Elena Vasquez picking her way through the brush. A thermos in one hand and what looked like sandwiches in the other. She'd been making these unannounced visits every few days, claiming she was just checking on the hermit. But Marcus suspected deeper motives. "You know there's a perfectly good lumber yard 20 minutes from town," she said, settling onto a fallen log he'd positioned as a makeshift bench. "They deliver. Where's the soul in that?" Marcus ran his palm along the fresh-cut surface of the beam. "This tree's been growing for maybe 200 years. Seems wrong to rush its transformation." Elena uncapped the thermos and poured steaming coffee into the lid. The rich aroma mixed with pine sap and sawdust created something that smelled like purpose. "My grandmother would have liked you," she said. "She used to say modern people had forgotten how to listen to materials." Smart woman. Marcus accepted the coffee gratefully. He'd rigged a basic camp kitchen, but good coffee remained beyond his current capabilities. Came here from Mexico with nothing but her husband and a head full of architectural dreams. She designed half the historic buildings in town, though the credit usually went to the men who built them. Marcus studied Elena over the rim of the cup. She had a way of sharing information that felt both casual and deliberate, like she was building something, with her words, the same way he built with wood. "Architecture runs in your family?" "Guilty. Though I specialize in preservation these days, old buildings tell stories if you know how to read them." She gestured toward the precise layout of his work area. "Speaking of which, you've got some interesting ideas brewing here. Those foundation stones you've been laying, that's not standard cabin construction." Marcus had hoped no one would notice the complexity of his groundwork yet. The foundation he'd been preparing would support something far more ambitious than a simple shelter, but he wasn't ready to explain the visions that haunted his sleep. Dreams of soaring spaces and intricate joinery, of buildings that seemed to emerge from his hands as if he'd designed them lifetimes ago. "Just want it to last," he said. Elena unwrapped a sandwich and offered him half. "And the way you're positioning everything to catch specific angles of light? Also just for durability?" The woman was too observant for his comfort. Marcus bit into the sandwich, turkey and some kind of sharp cheese, and bought time by chewing slowly. The truth was, he couldn't fully explain his choices. Each decision felt guided by instincts he didn't recognize, as if his hands knew things his mind had forgotten. "You remind me of someone," Elena continued. "Can't quite place who, but there's something familiar about your approach. The way you measure twice and cut once, but with this underlying confidence that suggests you've done this before. A lot. I helped my grandfather build a barn once," Marcus offered weakly. "Right. And I once changed a light bulb, so clearly I'm an electrician." Elena's laugh held no mockery, only gentle skepticism. "Look, whatever your story is, it's yours to tell or not, but this town has a long memory, and my grandmother kept meticulous records. If you've got history here, I'll find it eventually." The warning felt more like a promise than a threat. Marcus found himself oddly comforted by the idea that someone might unravel the mysteries that even he couldn't fully grasp. Since arriving here, he'd been experiencing flashes of knowledge that seemed to come from nowhere. Understanding of load-bearing calculations, of how light would move through spaces not yet built, of construction techniques he'd never formally learned. Maybe that wouldn't be such a bad thing, he heard himself say. Elena smiled and rose to leave. "I'll hold you to that confession. And Marcus, whatever you're really building here, it's going to be magnificent." The sound of approaching footsteps on gravel pulled Marcus from his morning meditation on the cabin's front porch. He'd been watching the mist rise from the valley below, coffee growing cold in his hands, when the distinctive crunch of multiple vehicles reached his ears. Through the trees, he could make out the glint of official vehicles, county trucks, and what looked like a news van. His jaw tightened. Word had finally spread beyond the small circle of locals who'd discovered his sanctuary. "Mr. Chen?" The voice belonged to a woman in her 50s, stepping out of the lead vehicle with a clipboard and an expression of barely concealed amazement. "I'm Patricia Henley, Whitmore County Building Inspector. We've received some unusual reports about construction activity on this property." Marcus descended the hand-carved steps slowly, noting how her eyes tracked every detail of the structure behind him. The morning light caught the intricate joinery work, the seamless integration of stone and timber, the impossible curves that seemed to defy conventional building methods. "Good morning, Miss Henley." He kept his voice level, non-committal. "Coffee's fresh if you'd like some." That's very kind, but I'm here on official business." She fumbled with her paperwork, clearly struggling to reconcile the man before her with what she was seeing. "We need to discuss permits, inspections, compliance with county building codes." Behind her, a young man with a camera had begun filming, and Marcus caught sight of a woman with perfectly styled hair speaking into a microphone. The circus had arrived. "You built this yourself?" Patricia's professional demeanor cracked slightly as she craned her neck to take in the roofline. "With no permits filed, no inspections scheduled, I built it with my own hands, on my own land." Marcus gestured toward the cabin. "Would you like to inspect it properly?" The tour that followed left Patricia speechless more than once. In the main room, she ran her fingers along joints so precise they looked machined, testing load-bearing beams that showed not the slightest give. The stone fireplace drew her attention for a full 10 minutes as she examined the flawless masonry work. "This chimney design," she murmured, pulling out a measuring device. "It's incredibly sophisticated, the draft calculations alone." She looked up at him sharply. "Where did you learn to build like this?" Marcus busied himself adjusting a window that needed no adjustment. "You pick things up over the years." "Mr. Chen, this isn't something you pick up. This is master craftsman work. This is—" She paused in the kitchen, staring at the hand-forged hardware, the seamless stone countertops. "This is architectural engineering at a level I've rarely seen." Through the window, Marcus watched more vehicles arrive. A white pickup truck caught his attention. Tom Bradley from the hardware store, probably drawn by curiosity like everyone else. But it was the black sedan pulling up behind the news van that made his blood run cold. Patricia was still talking, something about retroactive permits and structural assessments, but Marcus had stopped listening. Through the windshield of the sedan, he could see a face he'd hoped never to encounter again. Sharp features, silver hair, eyes that missed nothing. David Cartwright hadn't changed much in 15 years. "Extraordinary craftsmanship, but regulations exist for public safety." Patricia's voice faded into background noise as Marcus watched Cartwright step out of his car, surveying the cabin with the calculating gaze Marcus remembered too well. "Excuse me," Marcus interrupted, moving toward the door. "I need some air." He stepped onto the porch just as Cartwright approached, that familiar predatory smile playing at the corners of his mouth. The years fell away in an instant, the late nights, the pressure, the impossible deadlines, the project that had changed everything. "Hello, Marcus." Cartwright's voice carried the same smooth authority it always had. "Magnificent work, as always. Though I have to say, building hidden masterpieces in the wilderness seems like a waste of your particular talents." The news crew had noticed their interaction, cameras swinging toward them. Marcus kept his expression neutral, despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "I'm retired," Marcus said quietly. "Are you?" Cartwright stepped closer, his voice dropping so only Marcus could hear. "Because this little display suggests otherwise. Still the perfectionist, I see. Still creating marvels that make people ask uncomfortable questions." Patricia emerged from the cabin, her inspection apparently complete, but she stopped short when she noticed the tension between the two men. "The Meridian project was a long time ago," Marcus said, his words carefully measured. Cartwright's smile widened. "Was it? Because looking at this place, at the techniques you've employed, it seems like yesterday to me. And I suspect our mutual friends would be very interested to know that Marcus Chen is alive and well, and still creating impossibilities with his bare hands." The mountain air suddenly felt thin. After 15 years of carefully constructed anonymity, his past had found him. The sound of approaching vehicles broke through the morning stillness like stones through glass. Marcus set down his handplane, the smooth cedar shaving curling away from the beam he'd been shaping. Through the trees, he could see flashes of white and blue, sheriff's department vehicles winding up the old logging road. His chest tightened, but his hands remained steady. This moment had been inevitable since the first day he'd driven a nail into these timbers. The land belonged to someone, and that someone had finally noticed. 3 vehicles emerged from the forest, two sheriff's cruisers, and a black SUV with county plates. Marcus walked down from the elevated foundation of what would become his great room, brushing wood dust from his flannel shirt. The structure behind him had grown into something that defied explanation, soaring timber frames joined with traditional Japanese joinery, each beam fitted so precisely that no nails were needed. The foundation itself was a marvel of stonework, each boulder placed with the precision of a master mason. Sheriff Tom Brennan stepped out of the lead cruiser, his weathered face creased with confusion as he took in the sight. Behind him emerged Deputy Sarah Chen and a thin man in an expensive suit carrying a briefcase. Marcus had known this day would come, but seeing it unfold still felt like watching a slow-motion collision. "Mr. Wade?" Sheriff Brennan's voice carried across the clearing. "I'm going to need you to step away from the structure, sir." Marcus raised his hands slightly, showing empty palms. "No trouble here, Sheriff. I assume this is about the land rights." The man in the suit stepped forward, his city shoes slipping slightly on the pine needles. "Mr. Wade, I'm Jonathan Pierce from the County Planning Office. This land is owned by Cascade Holdings LLC, and you're in violation of multiple building codes, not to mention trespassing." "Understood." Marcus's voice remained calm, though his mind was racing through possibilities. He'd known this was borrowed time, but he'd hoped for more of it. Deputy Chen was walking slowly around the structure, her expression shifting from official skepticism to something approaching awe. "Sheriff," she called out, her voice strangely hesitant, "you need to see this." The craftsmanship was impossible to ignore. Every joint was perfect, every angle calculated with mathematical precision. The stonework looked like it had grown from the earth itself, and the timber framing displayed a level of skill that belonged in architectural magazines, not hidden in the Oregon wilderness. Pierce pulled out his phone, snapping photos. "This is still illegal construction, regardless of the quality." "How long have you been building this?" Brennan asked, his official demeanor softening slightly. 3 months, Marcus replied. "Started the day my divorce was finalized." 3 months? Chen stopped walking and stared at him. This should have taken a crew of specialists at least a year. Pierce was reviewing something on his tablet. "According to our records, Mr. Wade, you're listed as a farm equipment operator. Where did you learn to build like this?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Marcus found himself at the edge of truths he'd spent decades burying. "I picked things up over the years." "This isn't something you just pick up," Chen said, running her hand along a beam joint. "This is master-level craftsmanship. The stonework alone." She trailed off, photographing the foundation with her phone. Sheriff Brennan was studying Marcus with new interest. "Wade, Marcus Wade. Why does that name sound familiar?" Marcus's throat tightened. The carefully constructed simplicity of his life was unraveling with each passing moment. "It's a common enough name." Pierce was making notes furiously. "Regardless of Mr. Wade's skills, this is unauthorized construction on private property. We're going to need you to cease all work immediately and contact the landowners about removal." "Who owns it?" Marcus asked, though he suspected he didn't want to know the answer. Pierce consulted his tablet again. "Cascade Holdings LLC. It's a subsidiary of—" He paused, scrolling through information. "Meridian Development Group." The name hit Marcus like cold water. Meridian Development, one of the Pacific Northwest's largest commercial developers. And if his memory served him correctly, a company that had tried unsuccessfully to buy his farm 2 years before Diana filed for divorce. "I know that look," Brennan said quietly. "You recognize the name." Marcus nodded slowly. "They made an offer on my farm before the divorce. A generous offer." Chen's eyes sharpened. "How generous?" "Generous enough that my ex-wife thought I was crazy for turning it down." The pieces were falling into a pattern that made Marcus's skin crawl. Pierce was already on his phone, speaking in low, urgent tones to someone about the situation. The word extraordinary came through clearly, along with immediate assessment. Brennan stepped closer to Marcus, lowering his voice. "Son, I've got a feeling there's more to your story than meets the eye, and I've got an even stronger feeling that you building here on this particular piece of land isn't nearly as much of a coincidence as it appears. Marcus looked back at his half-finished home, its timber bones reaching toward the sky like prayers made manifest. Everything he'd built, everything he'd hoped to reclaim about himself, now stood at the center of something much larger and more dangerous than he'd imagined. The morning brought an unwelcome visitor in the form of Harold Kingsley's black Mercedes winding up the mountain path. Marcus watched from his kitchen window as dust clouds announced the arrival, his coffee growing cold in his hands. He'd been expecting this confrontation ever since the newspaper article, but that didn't make it any less unwelcome. Harold emerged from the car wearing his signature grey suit, completely inappropriate for the terrain. Behind him stepped a younger man with a briefcase and the nervous energy of a junior associate. They approached the cabin like diplomats entering hostile territory. Marcus opened the door before they could knock. Harold. Marcus. The older man's eyes swept across the visible portions of the structure, calculating. Impressive work. Though I have to admit, I'm puzzled by your choice of retirement activities. I wasn't aware my hobbies required your approval. Harold's laugh carried no warmth. Hobbies? Is that what we're calling it? He gestured toward the soaring beams and intricate joinery visible through the open door. This isn't the work of a hobby carpenter, and we both know it. The associate shifted uncomfortably, clearly sensing undercurrents he couldn't interpret. Marcus made no move to invite them inside. What do you want, Harold? The same thing I've always wanted. Answers. Harold's voice hardened. 23 years ago, you walked away from everything, the firm, the projects, the life we built together. You became a nobody, married a schoolteacher, played farmer. And now this. He stepped closer. Where did you really go during those agricultural conferences you claimed to attend? Marcus felt the familiar weight of old secrets pressing against his chest. I told you then, and I'm telling you now, some chapters close for good reason. Do they? Because this cabin tells a different story. The joinery techniques, the structural innovations, the materials. Harold pulled out his phone, scrolling through what appeared to be architectural forums. People are calling it revolutionary. They're saying whoever built this understands construction methods that died out decades ago, combined with engineering that shouldn't be possible without modern computer modeling. The associate finally spoke up, his voice thin with excitement. Sir, if we could just examine the foundation systems. No. Marcus's voice cut through the morning air like an axe through timber. You're trespassing on private property, and this conversation is over. Harold smiled, and Marcus recognized the expression from their old partnership, the look of a man who believed he held all the cards. Actually, it's not that simple. See, I've been doing some research since that article came out, cross-referencing dates, locations, project timelines. He paused for effect. Funny thing about the Nakamura Cultural Center in Kyoto. Beautiful work, completed in 2001. The architect of record died in 2018, but before he passed, he mentioned in an interview that the most crucial elements of the design came from a mysterious American consultant who appeared for 6 months and then vanished. Marcus felt his carefully constructed world beginning to shift, like timber settling after years of weathering. Then there's the restoration of the Benedictine monastery in Bavaria, 2004. Again, an unnamed American specialist who somehow understood 13th century building techniques better than scholars who'd spent their lives studying them. Harold's eyes glittered with triumph. Should I continue? The sustainable housing project in Costa Rica, the earthquake-resistant school in Nepal, all featuring innovative approaches that seemed to come from nowhere. The associate was scribbling notes now, his head swiveling between the two men like he was watching a tennis match whose rules he didn't understand. You always were good at research, Marcus said quietly. I'm good at a lot of things, including putting together a compelling case that my former partner has been operating under assumed identities, possibly violating multiple international building codes and tax laws. Harold straightened his tie. Of course, if you were willing to discuss a partnership again, I might find myself less motivated to pursue those particular lines of inquiry. Marcus studied the man, who had once been his closest friend, noting the grey at his temples and the lines around his eyes. Success had made Harold harder, hungrier. The young architect who had once stayed up all night debating the spiritual aspects of space and light had become something else entirely. The answer is still no, even if it means I reveal everything, the false identities, the unreported income, the visa violations. Harold's voice turned cold. Even if it means I make sure every major architectural publication knows that Marcus Webb, simple farmer, has been living a lie? Marcus stepped back into his cabin, his hand on the door. Through the windows, he could see the trees that had sheltered his work, the mountain that had become his sanctuary. Everything he'd built here, not just the physical structure, but the peace he'd finally found, hung in the balance. "Give me 24 hours, he said finally. Harold nodded, satisfied. 24 hours, then we talk about the future. The morning mist clung to the forest floor as Marcus worked the handplane across a beam of reclaimed oak, each stroke revealing the wood's golden heart beneath weathered grey. 3 weeks had passed since Elena's unexpected visit, and he'd thrown himself into the construction with renewed intensity, as if building could somehow quiet the questions multiplying in his mind. The sound of approaching footsteps made him pause, too heavy for Elena, too purposeful for a casual hiker. Marcus set down his tools and moved to the edge of his property, where the trees gave way to the rough path he'd carved from the main trail. A man emerged from the shadows between the pines, tall, lean, wearing expensive hiking boots that had never seen real wilderness. His hair was silver at the temples, his face angular and intelligent. When their eyes met, Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. "Hello, Marcus," the stranger said, his voice carrying a slight accent that Marcus couldn't place. "You're a difficult man to find. I like it that way." Marcus didn't move from his position, every muscle tensed. "You're on private property." The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "My name is Victor Kozlov. I believe you knew my father." The name hit Marcus like a physical blow. Kozlov. He hadn't heard that name in 15 years, had hoped never to hear it again. His hand moved instinctively to his pocket, where he kept a utility knife, but Victor raised his hands in a gesture of peace. "I'm not here for revenge, if that's what you're thinking. I'm here about the Maltese project. That project died a long time ago." Marcus's voice was steel, along with everyone connected to it. "Not everyone." Victor stepped closer, and Marcus could see the family resemblance now. The same sharp cheekbones, the same calculating stare he remembered from photographs in classified files. "My father kept detailed records, Marcus, even after the Berlin incident." The forest seemed to grow quieter around them, as if nature itself sensed the weight of old secrets surfacing. Marcus felt 15 years of carefully constructed peace cracking like ice in spring. "What do you want, Kozlov?" Victor reached slowly into his jacket and withdrew a manila envelope, yellowed with age. "My father was many things, but he wasn't a fool. He knew the risks of his work, knew that someday someone might come looking for answers. He left this for you specifically." Marcus didn't take the envelope. "Your father was a war criminal." "My father was an architect," Victor replied quietly. "Just like you. The difference is, he never got the chance to disappear into a simple life. He never deserved the chance." "Perhaps not." Victor set the envelope on a nearby stump. "But the work you did together, the innovations, the structural breakthroughs, they didn't die with him. Someone is using them, Marcus. Someone has your designs." Despite himself, Marcus felt his curiosity kindle. "That's impossible. The files were destroyed." "The official files, yes. But you know as well as I do that nothing truly disappears in our world." Victor gestured toward the half-built structure behind Marcus. "I've seen your current work. Remarkable. You haven't lost your touch for creating the impossible." Marcus glanced back at his cabin, seeing it suddenly through different eyes. Had he unconsciously incorporated techniques from his past life? Elements that might identify him to those who knew what to look for? There's been a series of collapses, Victor continued. Buildings in Prague, Munich, Montreal, all designed using perverted versions of the Maltese principles. People are dying, Marcus. Innocent people. That's not my problem anymore. Isn't it? Victor's voice hardened. You created something beautiful, something that could revolutionize how we build, how we live. Now someone is twisting it into a weapon. 347 people dead so far. The number hung in the air between them like an accusation. Marcus felt the weight of it, the terrible mathematics of unintended consequences. Even if what you're saying is true, I can't help you. I'm out of that world. Are you? Victor looked meaningfully at the sophisticated joinery visible in Marcus's construction, the impossible cantilevers that shouldn't work but did. A man with your skills, living like a hermit, you can pretend to be a simple farmer, but your hands remember who you really are. Marcus picked up the envelope, his fingers tracing the familiar handwriting on the front. His name, written in the careful script he remembered from technical drawings decades old. I need time to think. Victor nodded and turned to leave, then paused. Marcus, there's something else you should know. The woman who's been visiting you, Elena Vasquez, she's not a journalist. The words struck Marcus like lightning. What are you talking about? But Victor was already walking away, his figure disappearing into the morning shadows as abruptly as he'd arrived, leaving Marcus alone with an envelope full of ghosts and the terrible realization that his carefully constructed isolation might have been an illusion all along. The morning Elena arrived at the cabin changed everything. She came through the trees like something from a dream, her dark hair catching the dappled sunlight, a leather portfolio clutched against her chest. Thomas watched from his workbench, hands frozen over the delicate joinery he'd been perfecting for the last 3 hours. I know who you are, she said without preamble, her voice carrying an accent he couldn't quite place. Thomas Kellerman, the ghost of Barcelona. The chisel slipped from his fingers, clattering against the wooden floor. No one had called him by that name in 15 years. He'd buried Thomas Kellerman, along with everything else from his previous life, the way he'd buried the awards, the recognition, the dreams that had once consumed him. I think you have the wrong person, he said carefully, not moving from his position at the bench. I'm just a farmer. Elena laughed, but there was no humor in it. Farmers don't build structures like this. She gestured around them at the soaring cathedral ceiling, the impossible angles of light streaming through strategically placed windows, the way every beam and joint created a symphony of mathematical precision. This is the work of a master architect, the work of the man who designed the Meridian complex in Barcelona before he vanished without a trace. Thomas stood slowly, studying her face. She was younger than he'd first thought, maybe early 30s, with intelligent dark eyes that missed nothing. There was something familiar about her features, something that made his chest tighten with recognition he couldn't quite grasp. Who are you? He asked. Elena Vasquez. She opened the portfolio, revealing photographs of his old work, buildings he'd designed in another lifetime, structures that had once been his pride and joy. I was 12 when your building collapsed, when 17 people died because of faulty materials and corrupted inspections that you signed off on. The words hit him like physical blows. He sank back onto the wooden stool, the weight of old guilt crushing down on him. I didn't know, he whispered. The materials, the inspections, they told me everything was approved. I trusted the wrong people. Elena's voice was steady, controlled, but he could hear the emotion beneath it. My father was one of those 17 people. He was working late that night, trying to finish the electrical work on the 3rd floor when the support beam gave way. Thomas closed his eyes, remembering that phone call 15 years ago. The panic in the construction manager's voice, the screaming sirens in the background, the way his entire world had crumbled in the space of a single conversation. I'm sorry, he said, knowing how inadequate the words were. I've been sorry every day since it happened. Sorry enough to disappear, sorry enough to let everyone else take the blame while you vanished into thin air. Elena moved closer, her footsteps echoing in the vast space. Do you know what happened to your partner? To Marcus Webb? Thomas looked up sharply. Marcus wasn't involved in the materials procurement. He was in Germany when he was arrested 3 months after you disappeared. Someone had to take responsibility for the design flaws, for the oversight failures. Since the famous Thomas Kellerman was nowhere to be found, Marcus became the scapegoat. Elena's voice was getting harder now, more accusatory. He spent 8 years in prison for your mistakes. The revelation hit Thomas like a sledgehammer. Marcus, brilliant, honest Marcus, who had believed in Thomas's vision even when no one else would, had paid for crimes he didn't commit. While Thomas had been hiding in self-imposed exile, his best friend and partner had been rotting in a cell. I didn't know, Thomas breathed. God, I didn't know. Of course you didn't. You were too busy playing hermit to face the consequences of your actions. Elena was standing directly in front of him now, her dark eyes blazing. But consequences have a way of finding you, don't they? Even here, in your beautiful sanctuary built from guilt and cowardice. Thomas stood abruptly, anger flaring despite his shame. Cowardice? I left because I couldn't bear the thought that my work, my dreams, had killed innocent people. I left because it was easier than staying and fighting for the truth. Elena's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. My father died believing you were a good man. He used to talk about the architect who cared about every detail, who insisted on using his own money for better materials when the budget ran short. That's why this is so hard. What do you mean? Elena reached into her portfolio and pulled out a manila folder, thick with documents and photographs. I've spent 15 years investigating that collapse. And I know who really killed my father. It wasn't you, Thomas. It was someone who used your reputation and your trust to cover their own crimes. Someone who let you take the fall while they got rich selling substandard materials to dozens of other projects. The folder felt heavy in Thomas's hands as Elena placed it before him. I need your help to prove it. The morning mist clung to the valley like smoke from a dying fire as Elena made her way down the narrow path toward Marcus's sanctuary. She'd barely slept, her mind churning over the implications of what she'd discovered in those old architectural journals. The sketches, the theories, the revolutionary designs that had never seen daylight, they all pointed to a truth that seemed impossible. Marcus was already awake when she arrived, standing on the deck with a steaming cup in his hands. The sight of him there, framed by the impossible geometry of his creation, made her heart skip in a way that had nothing to do with her investigation and everything to do with the man himself. You look like someone who's seen a ghost, he said, studying her face with those perceptive eyes that seemed to read her thoughts. Maybe I have. Elena climbed the steps, accepting the second cup he offered. The coffee was perfect, rich and smooth, like everything else he seemed to touch. I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Marcus leaned against the railing, his expression guarded but not unwelcoming. That depends on the question. Elena pulled out her tablet, swiping to the images she'd photographed the night before. Ancient blueprints, theoretical frameworks, design philosophies that predated modern sustainable architecture by decades. These are from my mentor's private collection. Professor Richardson spent his entire career studying lost architectural knowledge, designs that were suppressed or forgotten. She watched Marcus's face carefully as she showed him the sketches. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but he remained silent. The geometric principles you've used here, she continued, gesturing to the structure around them, they're not just innovative. They're based on theories that were supposedly lost when the Blackwood Institute was shut down in 1987. The cup in Marcus's hands stilled halfway to his lips. Where did you hear that name? So you do know it. Elena's pulse quickened. The Institute was conducting research into bio-integrated architecture, structures that could exist in perfect harmony with their environment. The government shut them down, classified everything, but some of their researchers disappeared rather than abandon their work. Marcus set down his cup and walked to the edge of the deck. For a long moment, he stared out at the forest, his shoulders rigid with tension. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of years. My father was Dr. Jonathan Blackwood. The Institute wasn't just his project, it was his obsession. Elena felt the pieces clicking into place like tumblers in a lock. You're his son. You learned from him. I was 15 when they shut us down, Marcus said, still not turning around. 15, and already deeper into the work than most graduate students. My father saw something in me, a natural understanding of how living systems could merge with constructed ones. What happened to him? Marcus's hands gripped the railing. They offered him a choice: destroy his life's work and accept a research position at a sanitized university program, or face federal prosecution for violating environmental regulations. The work we were doing, it threatened too many established interests. Elena stepped closer, drawn by the raw pain in his voice. But he chose a third option. He chose to disappear. Took me and everything we could carry and vanished into the Cascade Mountains. We spent 3 years building a hidden laboratory, continuing the research in secret. Marcus finally turned, and Elena saw a vulnerability in his eyes she'd never glimpsed before. He died in an avalanche when I was 18. I've been carrying his work forward ever since. The farm, the marriage, a cover, a way to live a normal life while I searched for the right place to build this. He gestured to the structure surrounding them. Sarah never knew. No one knew. Elena processed this revelation, understanding now why the house had felt so otherworldly. It wasn't just innovative architecture, it was the culmination of forbidden research, knowledge that had been buried by those who feared its implications. The investigation that brought me here, she said slowly, it wasn't random, was it? Marcus shook his head. When you started asking questions about sustainable building practices in remote areas, certain people took notice. They've been watching for any sign that the Institute's work survived, and now I've led them right to you. Perhaps. Or perhaps you're exactly who I've been waiting for. Marcus stepped closer, his eyes intense. My father always believed that knowledge belongs to the world, not locked away in government vaults. This house is proof that his theories work, that we can build in harmony with nature rather than in spite of it. Elena felt the weight of the moment, the choice that lay before her. She could walk away, file a sanitized report, and pretend this place didn't exist. Or she could step into a larger story, one that had been waiting decades for someone brave enough to tell it. The morning sun broke through the canopy above, casting shifting patterns of light across the deck. In that moment, surrounded by the impossible beauty of Marcus's creation and the truth of his heritage, Elena made her choice. The rain had stopped, but Sarah could still hear water dripping from the eaves as she stood in Marcus's kitchen, watching him prepare tea with movements that belonged in a different century. His hands moved with practiced precision, measuring leaves into a porcelain pot she was certain hadn't come from any local store. The newspapers will run the story tomorrow, she said finally, breaking the silence that had stretched between them since Detective Morrison left. About the missing persons cases being connected, Marcus nodded without looking up. I expected as much. They'll want to interview you, about what you found in the workshop, about the tools. She paused, studying his profile, about how you knew to look for those specific markings. The question hung in the air like morning mist. Marcus set down the tea strainer and turned to face her, his eyes holding depths she was only beginning to fathom. My grandfather was a carpenter, he said slowly, but not the kind who built houses for neighbors. He worked for people who valued discretion above all else, people who needed things hidden. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. What kind of things? During the war, he built secret rooms, false walls, passages that could hide entire families. Marcus's voice grew distant. After the war, his reputation followed him here. Certain individuals sought out his services for different reasons. The tea kettle whistled, sharp and urgent. Marcus removed it from the heat, his movements deliberate. Sarah watched him pour the steaming water, noting how his hands remained steady despite the weight of what he was revealing. The markings you found, she pressed gently. You recognize them because your grandfather taught you. He taught me many things: woodworking, metalcraft, how to read the signs that others leave behind. Marcus handed her a delicate cup, their fingers brushing momentarily. How to disappear when necessary. A chill ran down Sarah's spine that had nothing to do with the cooling air. Is that what you did? When your marriage ended? Marcus was quiet for a long moment, steam rising between them like a barrier. When he spoke, his voice carried years of carefully guarded pain. Catherine never knew about my grandfather's work, about the skills he passed down. I thought I could live a simple life, be the man she wanted me to be. He took a sip of tea, his eyes focusing on something beyond the windows. But when everything fell apart, when I lost the farm, the only place I could go was back to what he taught me. You built this place using his techniques. More than that. Marcus moved to the window, looking out at the forest that had sheltered his transformation. This entire structure is built according to his principles. Hidden supports, concealed joints, passages that serve multiple purposes. Sarah joined him at the window, her mind racing. The workshop where we found those markings, it wasn't the first time you'd seen them. No. His reflection in the glass looked haunted. My grandfather kept detailed records of his work, drawings, measurements, symbols used by the craftsmen he occasionally worked with, men who moved from town to town, never staying long enough to attract attention. Men like Thomas Hartwell. Marcus turned to her, surprise flickering across his features. You know that name? Morrison mentioned it. The police think he might be connected to the disappearances. Sarah set down her cup, pieces of a larger puzzle beginning to align in her mind. Your grandfather worked with him. Once. Just once, as far as I know. Marcus's expression darkened. Hartwell came through here maybe 20 years ago. He was looking for someone to help him with a project, something that required my grandfather's particular expertise. What kind of project? My grandfather never told me the details, but after Hartwell left he seemed different, worried. He made me promise never to use the markings Hartwell had shown him, never to work with anyone who bore his symbols. The implications sent ice through Sarah's veins. But you found those symbols in the workshop, which means Hartwell has been back, recently. Marcus faced her fully now, his expression grave. And if the missing persons cases are connected to his work? He didn't finish the sentence, but Sarah understood. The tools they'd found, the symbols carved into the workbench, they weren't just evidence of past crimes, they were signs that something was still happening. We have to tell Morrison, she said. We will. But Sarah, Marcus reached for her hand, his fingers warm against her suddenly cold skin. There's something else you need to know, about why I really built this place the way I did. Outside, the forest seemed to lean in closer, shadows deepening despite the afternoon light. Sarah felt as though she stood at the edge of a precipice, one more revelation away from a fall she couldn't predict. What do you mean? Marcus's grip tightened slightly, anchoring her to the moment even as the ground beneath her understanding began to shift. I didn't just come here to hide, he said quietly. I came here to wait. The morning sun filtered through the cabin's handcrafted windows as Marcus stood before his drafting table, spreading out blueprints that hadn't seen daylight in 15 years. Sarah watched from the kitchen doorway, coffee mug warming her hands as he traced architectural lines with fingers that had once shaped concrete and steel across 3 continents. The Nakamura Tower in Tokyo, he said without looking up, sensing her presence. 47 stories. I designed the entire structural system to flex with earthquakes while maintaining perfect acoustics in the concert hall on the 20th floor. Sarah approached slowly, studying the intricate drawings. The precision was breathtaking, every joint, every stress point calculated to mathematical perfection. Why did you stop? Marcus's hand stilled over a detail of the building's innovative foundation system. Because I realized I was building monuments to other people's dreams while my own life crumbled. He rolled up the blueprint carefully. Elena used to joke that I knew more about steel and glass than I did about her heart. Turns out she wasn't joking. The sound of vehicles approaching broke the morning quiet. Through the window they watched Sheriff Dawson emerge from his cruiser, followed by a sleek black sedan that looked distinctly out of place on the forest road. A woman in an expensive suit stepped out, her heels immediately sinking into the soft earth. "Victoria Chen," Marcus said quietly, recognizing her even at this distance. "My former partner." Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach. "Partner? Business partner. We co-founded Chen Whitmore Architectural before—" He gestured vaguely. "Before everything fell apart." Sheriff Dawson knocked, his expression troubled. Victoria stood behind him, her calculating gaze already assessing the cabin's innovative design. When Marcus opened the door, she smiled, the same predatory expression Sarah had seen on Elena's face. "Hello, Marcus. You've been difficult to find." "I wasn't hiding, Victoria. I was healing. In this charming little cottage." Her eyes swept the interior, taking in details that most people would miss. The way the support beams distributed weight, the subtle curves that gave the structure both strength and beauty. "Though I must say, your skills haven't diminished. This is actually quite impressive for wilderness architecture." Sheriff Dawson cleared his throat. "Marcus, Miss Chen here claims you have intellectual property that belongs to her company. Something about stolen designs?" Sarah watched Marcus's jaw tighten. "What designs, Victoria?" Victoria produced a tablet, swiping through images of building plans. "The Riverside Community Center project you were working on before your breakdown. The client is ready to move forward, but your designs have mysteriously vanished from our servers. Those weren't company designs. I was developing them independently. With company resources, on company time. You know the contract terms as well as I do." Victoria's smile sharpened. "I'm prepared to be generous, Marcus. Return the plans and we'll call it even. I might even have a position waiting for you back in Seattle." Sarah stepped forward. "He doesn't owe you anything." Victoria's gaze flicked to Sarah dismissively before returning to Marcus. "Your new girlfriend doesn't understand our industry, darling. Architecture isn't about romantic cabins in the woods. It's about legacy, about buildings that outlast their creators." "Like the Morrison complex?" Marcus asked quietly. The color drained from Victoria's face. "That was a long time ago. 6 people died when that foundation gave way. You insisted on using substandard materials to cut costs, remember? I took the blame because I was the structural engineer of record, but we both know whose decision it was." Sheriff Dawson looked between them sharply. "What are you talking about?" Marcus moved to his desk, pulling out a thick folder Sarah had never seen before. Insurance documents, correspondence, material specifications, all proving that Chen Whitmore knowingly used inferior concrete in the Morrison Complex foundation. "I've been carrying this guilt for 8 years, thinking I'd somehow missed a calculation error." Victoria's composed mask was slipping. "You can't prove anything. The investigation was closed. Because I didn't fight it. Because I was so consumed with guilt that I let my marriage fall apart and my career die rather than point fingers." Marcus handed the folder to Sheriff Dawson. "But I never threw away the evidence. You're bluffing. This is about the Riverside plans. This is about you tracking me down because you're terrified of what I might know. The Riverside plans were just an excuse." Marcus's voice was steady, years of pain crystallizing into clarity. "I'm not that broken man anymore, Victoria. I've rebuilt myself from the ground up, just like this cabin." Sarah felt a surge of pride watching Marcus face down his past. This was the man she'd glimpsed in quiet moments, brilliant, principled, unshakable when he finally found solid ground to stand on. Victoria looked around the cabin once more, her expression calculating. "This isn't over, Marcus." "Yes, it is." He moved to Sarah's side, their hands finding each other naturally. "I'm not running anymore." As Victoria's sedan disappeared down the forest road, Sarah squeezed Marcus's hand. The past had found them, but instead of destroying their sanctuary, it had only proven how strong the foundation they'd built together truly was. The morning sun cast long shadows across the meadow as Marcus stood before his creation, watching the news van disappear down the dirt road. The reporter's questions still echoed in his mind, particularly the last one. What's next for the man who built a miracle? He'd given some vague answer about enjoying the quiet, but the truth was more complicated than that. Sarah emerged from the house carrying 2 steaming cups of coffee, her bare feet leaving tracks in the dew-soaked grass. She'd stayed the night again, the 3rd time this week, and each morning felt more natural than the last. The walls he'd built around his heart were proving less sturdy than those he'd crafted from timber and stone. "Penny for your thoughts," she said, settling beside him on the bench he'd carved from a fallen oak. "Just thinking about what that reporter said, about the architectural review, the magazine spreads." Marcus accepted the coffee gratefully, inhaling its rich aroma. "Sometimes I wonder if I should have kept this place a secret." Sarah studied his profile, noting the tension in his jaw. Having second thoughts about the attention? Not second thoughts, exactly, but this was supposed to be my refuge, a place to disappear. He gestured toward the house, its organic curves seeming to breathe with the morning light. "Now it feels like I'm on display again." "You could always build another one," she said lightly, but there was something careful in her tone, somewhere even more remote. The suggestion hit him unexpectedly hard. The idea of leaving, of starting over again in some distant wilderness, should have appealed to him. It's what the old Marcus would have done, run when things got complicated. But the thought of abandoning this place, of leaving Sarah behind, felt like tearing away a piece of himself. "I've done enough running," he said finally. A comfortable silence settled between them, broken only by the distant call of a hawk circling overhead. Sarah reached into her jacket pocket and withdrew a folded envelope, worn soft from handling. "I need to tell you something," she began, her voice unusually hesitant. "I got a job offer. The university in Seattle. They want me to head up their new environmental architecture program." Marcus felt his chest tighten, but he kept his expression neutral. "That sounds like a big opportunity." "It is." She stared at the envelope. "They're offering tenure track, full funding for research, the chance to work with some of the most innovative minds in sustainable design." She paused. "I'd be crazy to turn it down. When do they need an answer?" "End of the week." Marcus nodded slowly, processing this new reality. Of course she would leave. Sarah was brilliant, ambitious, destined for bigger things than a small mountain town and a hermit with a mysterious past. He'd been a fool to think otherwise. "You should take it," he heard himself say. Sarah turned to face him fully. "Just like that?" "Just like that." He met her gaze, hoping his voice sounded steadier than he felt. "You deserve every opportunity that comes your way. Don't let—" he gestured vaguely between them. "Don't let this hold you back." Something flashed across her features, hurt, perhaps, or disappointment. "This? Is that what we're calling it?" The question hung in the air like morning mist. Marcus realized he was at another crossroads, one that had nothing to do with architectural reviews or media attention. This was about choosing between the safety of solitude and the terrifying vulnerability of connection. "Sarah, He started to speak, but was interrupted by the sound of an approaching vehicle. A black SUV wound its way up the mountain road, its tinted windows reflecting the morning sun like dark mirrors. Marcus stood slowly, every instinct suddenly alert. He recognized the vehicle type, the deliberate pace of its approach. Government plates became visible as it drew closer. "Expecting someone?" Sarah asked, noting his sudden tension. "No." His voice had gone flat, professional. "You should go inside." "Marcus, what's wrong?" The SUV pulled to a stop beside the house, and 2 figures emerged. A woman in a crisp navy suit and a man whose bearing screamed federal agent despite his casual clothes. Marcus felt 20 years fall away in an instant, muscle memory flooding back. The woman approached with measured steps, her smile polite but cold. "Mr. Chen. Or do you prefer Marcus Harrison these days?" Sarah looked between them, confusion evident on her face. "Marcus, who are these people?" He didn't answer, couldn't answer. His past had finally caught up with him, drawn by the attention he'd tried so hard to avoid. The architectural masterpiece that was supposed to be his sanctuary had become a beacon, calling to those who'd never stopped looking. "It's been a long time, Marcus," the woman continued. "We need to talk." The job offer in Sarah's hand suddenly seemed like the least of their problems. The courthouse steps felt like ice beneath Sarah's feet as she clutched the manila envelope containing the photographs. 3 days had passed since her discovery in Marcus's cabin, 3 days of sleepless nights and unanswered questions that gnawed at her like hungry wolves. Detective Rivera had agreed to meet her here, away from the prying eyes of the sheriff's department. "There are dates on the back," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Some go back 15 years. He wasn't just building houses, Detective, he was rebuilding history." Rivera flipped one photograph over, reading aloud, "Sarajevo, Reconstruction of the National Library, 2009. She looked up sharply. "Sarah, do you understand what this means? This isn't standard military service. This is specialized cultural preservation work, probably classified." A cold wind swept across the courthouse plaza, sending dead leaves skittering around their feet. Sarah pulled her jacket tighter, but the chill came from within. "There's more. I found architectural plans, blueprints for buildings I've never seen before, but they're in his handwriting. And there are letters, Detective, letters from organizations I can't even pronounce. Did you bring them?" Sarah hesitated. Taking the photographs had felt like a betrayal, but they were already in Rivera's hands. The letters felt more personal somehow, more intimate. "I memorized some of the names. UNESCO, something called the Monuments Men Foundation, and several European historical societies." Rivera's expression grew more serious with each revelation. "Sarah, your ex-husband might not be who any of us thought he was. The Monuments Men, that's an organization dedicated to protecting cultural artifacts during wartime. If Marcus was involved with them..." She trailed off, studying another photograph showing Marcus carefully examining what appeared to be ancient frescoes on a damaged church wall. But why hide it? Sarah's frustration finally boiled over. Why let everyone think he was just some simple farmer who got lucky with construction? Why let me think? She stopped herself before the words could escape, but Rivera's knowing look suggested she understood. People in that line of work often can't talk about it, even to family. National security, diplomatic sensitivities, ongoing operations. Rivera's phone buzzed, and she glanced at it with a frown. "Sarah, I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. In all your years married to Marcus, did he ever leave for extended periods? Trips he couldn't fully explain?" The question hit Sarah like a physical blow. Memories she had carefully buried began surfacing. Marcus's occasional disappearances, always explained as consulting work or helping a friend with a project. The times he'd return exhausted, sometimes with small injuries he'd dismiss as construction accidents. The way he'd sometimes wake at night, speaking in languages she didn't recognize. "God," she whispered, sinking onto a nearby bench. "How could I have been so blind?" Rivera sat beside her, her voice gentle but urgent. "You weren't blind. You trusted your husband. But Sarah, I need to know, during those trips, did he ever mention specific locations, names of colleagues, anything that seemed unusual?" Sarah closed her eyes, forcing herself to remember. "There was one time, maybe 3 years ago. He came back with this small piece of stone, beautifully carved. He said it was from a church they couldn't save, that at least he could preserve one piece of it. I thought he meant a local church, maybe something being demolished for development. Do you still have it?" "It's at the house, our old house." Sarah opened her eyes, meeting Rivera's gaze. "Detective, what does this have to do with Frank's murder? What does any of this have to do with what's happening now?" Rivera was quiet for a long moment, watching a group of lawyers hurry up the courthouse steps. "I'm beginning to think Frank Miller discovered something about Marcus's past, something he shouldn't have known. Maybe he tried to use it. Maybe he just asked the wrong questions to the wrong people." "You think Marcus killed him?" "I think," Rivera said carefully, that there are forces at play here bigger than a simple land dispute. If Marcus was involved in sensitive international work, if he made enemies, or if someone wants to exploit his skills. She stood, handing the photographs back to Sarah. I need you to be very careful. If I'm right about what these pictures represent, then you might be in more danger than we realized. Sarah stared at the photographs in her hands, seeing her ex-husband's face as if for the first time. The man she thought she knew was disappearing, replaced by someone far more complex and potentially dangerous than she'd ever imagined. The morning light filtered through the workshop windows as Thomas ran his fingers along the carved inscription hidden beneath his workbench. His real name, Tomas Castellano, etched in elegant script alongside coordinates that had haunted his dreams for 20 years. Elena stood beside him, her presence both comforting and electric in the charged silence. My grandfather built the original casa when he fled Spain in 1937, Thomas said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of buried history. He was an architect, a master craftsman who designed palaces for nobility before the war changed everything. Elena knelt beside him, studying the intricate carvings that covered every surface of the hidden compartment. These symbols, they're not random, are they? Building techniques, measurements, architectural secrets, passed down through generations. My father taught them to me in whispers, afraid that speaking too loudly would summon the ghosts we'd been running from. Thomas pulled out a rolled leather portfolio, its edges worn smooth by decades of careful handling. When I married Margaret, I thought I could leave all this behind. Become just another American farmer, simple and uncomplicated. The leather crackled as he unrolled architectural drawings that took Elena's breath away. Detailed plans for structures that seemed to defy physics. Spiraling towers that captured wind for natural cooling, underground chambers that regulated temperature through ingenious airflow systems, bridges that appeared to float without visible support. Your cabin, Elena whispered, recognition dawning. The way it sits on the hillside, how the rooms flow together. You've been building from these plans all along. Fragments of them, modified, simplified, but yes. Thomas traced a finger along one of the drawings, a grand estate that bore unmistakable similarities to the masterpiece rising from his forest. This was supposed to be our family's legacy, a place where the old knowledge could be preserved and passed on. Elena noticed how his hands trembled slightly as he spoke, the careful control he maintained beginning to crack. What happened? My father died when I was 19. Heart attack brought on by stress. We'd been receiving letters, threats from people who claimed we'd stolen what belonged to them. Seems some of grandfather's former clients survived the war and wanted compensation for lost properties. Thomas's laugh held no humor. We had nothing left to give. The original casa had burned down years earlier. All we had were these plans and the knowledge in our heads. The workshop fell silent except for the distant sound of hammering from the main house. Construction crews had been working steadily for weeks, but Elena realized now that their efforts were merely the visible portion of something much grander and much more dangerous. That's why you retreated into farming, she said, understanding flooding through her. You were hiding. For 25 years it worked. Margaret knew bits and pieces, but she preferred her version of our story. Successful farmer, simple life, respectable future. When I started sketching building plans during our marriage troubles, she saw it as another one of my failures, another way I was disappointing her. Elena stood and walked to the window, processing the magnitude of what Thomas had revealed. Outside, his architectural marvel rose from the wilderness like something from another century, beautiful and impossible in equal measure. But they found you anyway. Thomas joined her at the window, his reflection ghost-like in the morning glass. The lawyers who've been circling since my divorce, they're not just ambulance chasers looking for assets to claim. Someone hired them to track down the Castellano family. They want the plans, the knowledge, whatever survived of grandfather's work. How much are they worth? Enough to kill for, apparently. Thomas pulled a crumpled letter from his pocket, the paper worn from repeated handling. This arrived last week. They're claiming grandfather stole proprietary architectural techniques from a Barcelona firm before fleeing Spain. They want everything: the plans, the buildings, compensation for 7 decades of stolen intellectual property. Elena read the letter quickly, her reporter's instincts immediately noting the inconsistencies and gaps in the legal language. This is nonsense. No court would... Courts don't matter if they never make it to trial. Thomas took back the letter, his jaw set with grim determination. These people have been hunting my family for generations. They burned down the original casa in 1987, though authorities called it an electrical fire. They've threatened my cousins in New Mexico, broken into my uncle's home in Colorado. The implications hit Elena like a physical blow. That's why you're finishing the house so quickly. You're not just building a home, you're creating a fortress. Thomas nodded, his eyes fixed on the magnificent structure that represented both his greatest achievement and potentially his final stand. Every secret passage, every hidden chamber, every architectural innovation grandfather ever conceived is being built into these walls. If they want the Castellano legacy, they'll have to take it by force. Elena reached for his hand, finding it warm and steady despite everything. Then we'd better make sure you're ready for them. The morning light filtered through the hand-carved windows of Marcus's sanctuary, casting geometric patterns across the polished stone floor. He stood before the massive oak table that dominated the central room, Sarah's architectural drawings spread before him like pieces of a puzzle finally coming together. Her presence filled the space differently now, not as an intruder or even a guest, but as someone who belonged here among the secrets he'd spent 15 years protecting. The proportions are perfect, Sarah whispered, her finger tracing the elevation drawings she'd completed overnight. But Marcus, these aren't just buildings. They're monuments. Each one tells a story. He nodded slowly, his weathered hands smoothing over the sketches of structures that existed only in his memory now. The children's hospital in Sarajevo, with its reinforced walls that had withstood mortar fire. The earthquake-resistant school in Guatemala, where he'd incorporated ancient Mayan engineering principles. The refugee center in Sudan, designed to channel even the slightest breeze for cooling in the brutal heat. 23 buildings across 4 continents, Marcus said quietly. Each one designed to save lives, to give hope where there was none, and each one signed with the same symbol. He pointed to a small mark in the corner of Sarah's drawing, the interlocking circles she'd first noticed carved into his cabin's foundation. Sarah's breath caught as understanding dawned. The Meridian Group, the anonymous architectural collective that disappeared after 9/11. Marcus, you weren't just part of it. You were the lead architect. The weight of his hidden identity settled between them like a physical presence. For 15 years, he'd let the world believe Marcus Chen was dead, killed in the collapse of a building he designed in Pakistan. The farmer who'd married Eleanor, who'd lived quietly in their small town, who'd been dismissed as simple and unambitious, that man had been carefully constructed, a shelter as deliberate as any he'd ever built. Why? Sarah asked. Why hide this? Why let everyone think you were just a failure? Marcus's laugh held no bitterness now, only tired acceptance. Because the work we did, the places we built, they made us targets. 3 of my colleagues died in what were called accidents. Buildings we designed were bombed not for political reasons, but because someone didn't want hope taking root in hopeless places. He moved to the window, looking out at the forest that had hidden his true home. I thought I could protect Eleanor by being nobody. I thought love would be enough to fill the space where my real self used to be. Sarah joined him at the window, her reflection ghost-like in the glass beside his. But it wasn't enough. Eleanor fell in love with an architect who dreamed of changing the world. She married a farmer who grew corn and fixed tractors and never spoke of anything larger than the next season's planting. His voice carried the weight of accumulated regrets. I watched her suffocate slowly, year by year, wondering why the man she'd fallen for had simply vanished. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. He'd become a master of building homes, but had destroyed his own in the process. Sarah turned to face him, her eyes bright with unshed tears, and something else, something that made his chest tighten with possibility. She's been calling, Marcus said suddenly. Eleanor, 3 times since yesterday. I think Detective Morrison talked to her. Sarah's hand found his arm, steady and warm. What will you tell her? The truth. Finally. He gestured toward the drawings, toward the evidence of his concealed life spread across the table. All of it. She deserves to know why I disappeared, why I became someone she couldn't love. And after that? The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications neither was quite ready to voice. Marcus turned from the window, studying Sarah's face in the morning light. She'd sketched his secrets with the same careful attention she'd once given to designing strip malls and parking garages, but somewhere in the process, she'd also drawn out parts of himself he'd thought were dead. "There's something else," he said, moving to a cabinet she hadn't noticed before. From it he withdrew a thick folder marked with corporate letterhead. 3 months ago, before Eleanor filed for divorce, before my world fell apart, this arrived. Sarah opened the folder, her architect's eye immediately grasping the significance of what she saw. Building permits for a medical complex in Kenya, funding authorizations from an international relief organization, approval letters for a project that would serve 500,000 people. "They found me," Marcus said simply. Somehow, after all these years, they found Marcus Chen. The project needs an architect who understands how to build in impossible conditions, how to create something permanent in a place where nothing lasts. He paused, watching her face. "The question is, does that architect still exist, or did I bury him so deep that he can't find his way back?" Sarah looked up from the papers, her eyes holding an answer that would change everything. The morning sun cast long shadows across the clearing as Marcus stood on the completed observation deck, watching 3 black SUVs wind their way up the mountain road. His hands remained steady on the railing, the same hands that had carved every beam, fitted every joint, and built something extraordinary from nothing but timber and determination. Sarah emerged from the house, coffee steaming in her hands. "They're early," she said quietly, settling beside him. Punctuality was always one of their virtues. Marcus accepted the mug she offered, noting how natural this felt. Her presence, the shared silence, the way she seemed to understand without explanation that these vehicles carried his past to their doorstep. The lead SUV stopped at the tree line, its occupants clearly visible through the windshield. Director Harrison stepped out first, his silver hair catching the light. Behind him came Agent Torres, still young and eager, followed by 3 others Marcus recognized despite the years. They moved with practiced caution, spreading into a loose formation as they approached. "Jesus Christ, Marcus," Harrison breathed, as the house came into full view. His professional composure cracked as he took in the soaring timber frame, the intricate joinery work, the mathematical precision of every angle. "You built this? With your hands?" "Hello, Robert." Marcus descended the steps slowly, Sarah close behind. "I figured you'd find me eventually. Took us longer than it should have. Your disappearing act was thorough." Harrison's eyes never stopped moving, cataloguing details, searching for threats that weren't there. "We need to talk." "I assumed as much." "Coffee?" The incongruity of offering refreshments to his former CIA handlers in a kitchen he'd built log by log wasn't lost on Marcus. Sarah moved with quiet efficiency, preparing additional mugs while the agents filed in, their tactical awareness at odds with the warm domesticity of the space. "Chen is dead," Harrison said without preamble once they were seated around the handcrafted dining table. 3 days ago. Professional hit, but sloppy enough to send a message. Marcus felt Sarah's questioning glance, but kept his expression neutral. "I've been here for 8 months, Robert. Building, farming, living quietly." "We know, but Chen's death activates protocols. The Beijing operation from '98 is compromised. They're tying up loose ends." "There are no loose ends. We extracted their entire network." "Not all of it." Torres leaned forward, consulting his tablet. Chen was working a side deal, arms trafficking through the Golden Triangle. When we rolled up his contacts, we missed the financial pipeline. It's been running for 25 years, Robert. $250 million in dark money. The name hung between them, Robert, Not Marcus the farmer, not the broken man who'd fled civilization 8 months ago. Robert Chen, the ghost identity Marcus had worn for 18 months while dismantling a Chinese intelligence ring that had cost 3 American agents their lives. Sarah's hand found his under the table, her touch grounding him in the present. "How bad?" she asked quietly. Harrison's eyebrows rose slightly at her inclusion in the conversation, but he answered directly, "Bad. The surviving network has resources and motivation. They've already made 2 attempts on former assets in the past month. Unsuccessful, I assume, or you'd be having a different conversation. Unsuccessful, yes, but they're learning, adapting. Your isolation here is both protection and vulnerability, Marcus. If they find you, they won't." The certainty in Marcus's voice surprised even him. "This isn't just a house, Robert. It's a fortress. Every beam placed with purpose, every sightline calculated. You want to know what I learned in the wilderness? That the skills you taught me, observation, planning, preparation, they apply to more than just espionage." Agent Torres stood, moving to examine the interior wall construction, the joinery work. These are load-bearing connections, but they're designed to be removable. You can reconfigure the internal layout. Among other features, Marcus allowed himself a small smile. The foundation has 3 separate root cellars connected by tunnels. The water system includes filtration and backup supplies. Solar array with battery storage hidden in the tree line. This place can sustain 2 people for 6 months without external contact. Harrison whistled low. "You didn't just disappear, Marcus. You prepared for war. I prepared for peace. But I learned long ago that the 2 require similar planning." Sarah squeezed his hand. "What do they want you to do?" "Come back," Torres answered when Harrison hesitated. "Help us roll up the remaining network. You know their methods, their contacts, their psychology better than anyone. And after..." Marcus's question carried weight beyond the immediate operation. "After, you disappear again. Officially this time. New identity, new history, government protection." Harrison's expression softened slightly. "Both of you, if necessary." The offer hung in the air like morning mist. Marcus looked around the room, at the perfect joints he'd cut by hand, the grain patterns he'd matched with obsessive care, the windows positioned to frame specific views of the mountains. Then he looked at Sarah, seeing in her eyes the same recognition of crossroads. "I'll need 3 days to secure the property," he said finally. "And Sarah comes with me. Non-negotiable." Harrison nodded slowly. 3 days. Then we finish this.